My mother-in-law said my 7-year-old son shouldn't be our life insurance beneficiary, and she should get the money instead to manage it properly. When me and Robert got married 8 years ago, his mom Linda seemed normal. She was a retired teacher, lived alone in her paid-off condo, always talked about how independent she was. We had our son Oliver 5 years ago, and she was thrilled to be a grandma. Babysat sometimes, bought him clothes, normal grandma stuff. Robert and I both worked, him as an electrician and me in purchasing at a medical supply company. We weren't rich, but we were stable. Had good insurance through my job, savings account for Oliver's college, regular middle-class life. Everything was fine until Linda's friend Barb died last year. Barb's kids got everything, obviously, and Linda became obsessed with inheritance. Started asking about our wills, life insurance, who got what if something happened. We told her Oliver was the beneficiary of everything with a trust until he turned 25. She said that was smart. Then at Oliver's 7th birthday party, Linda pulled us aside and said she'd been thinking about our insurance situation. Said it was wasteful having a 7-year-old as beneficiary since he had his whole life ahead of him to make money. We laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. She said if something happened to us, the money should go to someone who could properly manage it for Oliver. We said that's what the trustee was for. She said trustees take fees and can't be trusted. Then she actually said the words that she should be the beneficiary because she'd make sure Oliver got what he needed when he needed it. Robert told her that wasn't happening. She got upset and said she'd raised Robert without help and knew how to handle money better than some bank trustee. I said the decision was final and changed the subject, but Linda didn't stop. Every visit became about the insurance. She'd bring articles about trustees stealing from children, stories about kids who inherited too young and ruined their lives. Said we were setting Oliver up for failure by giving him too much too soon. Robert kept shutting her down, but she kept pushing. Then she started getting creative. Told Robert I was probably planning to change the beneficiary to my family behind his back. Told me Robert had mentioned maybe his mom had a point, playing us against each other like we didn't talk. When that didn't work, she went to Oliver. Started telling him money was bad for children, that grandma would take care of him if mommy and daddy went to heaven. Oliver came home crying, asking if we were dying. That crossed a line. Robert went to her condo and told her to stop or she wouldn't see Oliver anymore. She called crying, saying we were being cruel, that she just wanted to protect everyone. The next week, our insurance company called. Someone had requested beneficiary change forms using Robert's information. Linda had his social security number from when she'd done his taxes years ago. She'd actually tried to forge documents to make herself the beneficiary. The insurance company flagged it as suspicious since Robert had called them a month earlier specifically saying no changes were planned. We filed a police report. Linda hired a lawyer who contacted us saying she was concerned about our mental capacity to make financial decisions. Said a loving grandmother wouldn't try to steal from her grandson without good reason. The lawyer dropped her after we showed him the forged documents. But Linda wasn't done. She called CPS saying we were neglecting Oliver financially, that we spent his college fund on vacations. We'd been to Wisconsin once. CPS came, saw Oliver's room, his clothes, his toys, our bank statements showing regular deposits to his college account. Case closed in a week. The investigator actually apologized and said it was clearly a vindictive report. That's when I decided Linda needed to learn about consequences. See, Robert and I did have wills leaving everything to Oliver, but we also had a provision that if anyone contested the will or tried to interfere with our estate planning, they got nothing. Not even sentimental items. Linda didn't know about that clause. I suggested to Robert we should update our wills just to be safe. Made sure Linda knew we were going to the lawyer. She got excited, probably thought we were reconsidering. We did update them. Added a specific paragraph about how Linda had attempted insurance fraud and filed false reports so she was explicitly excluded from everything, including family photos and Robert's dad's watch she'd been asking for. Then we added my sister as Oliver's guardian if something happened to us. Linda had been assuming she'd get custody. We also created an educational trust for Oliver funded by a separate policy, with my brother as trustee. Made it irrevocable so even we couldn't change it if someone tried to pressure us. Then we invited Linda for dinner to discuss the family future. She showed up with folders about why elderly beneficiaries made more sense. Robert handed her a copy of the new will provisions. She read them 3 times. Started screaming that we couldn't cut her out. She was Oliver's grandmother. We said that's what the trustee was for, exactly what we'd been telling her for months. Linda grabbed the papers off the table and threw them across the room, pages scattering everywhere. She screamed that we couldn't do this, that she was Oliver's grandmother and had rights. Robert stayed completely calm, which made me proud because I could see his jaw clenching. He told her that her fraud attempt and the false CPS report made this necessary to protect Oliver's future. She kept yelling about how we were making a mistake, how trustees steal money, how she was the only one who really cared about Oliver. Robert said if she really cared, she wouldn't have forged his signature or lied to child services. Linda's face went red and she threatened to sue for grandparents' rights. I told her to do whatever she needed to do, but the decision was final. She grabbed her purse and folders and stormed toward the door. The slam was so hard that the picture frame of Oliver's first day of kindergarten fell off the wall in the hallway. Glass cracked across his smiling face. The next morning, my phone buzzed 17 times before 7 o'clock. All Linda calling Robert. He finally answered on the 18th call while we were making breakfast. I could hear her crying through the phone from across the kitchen. She was going on about how we were destroying the family, keeping her from her only grandchild, ruining everything. Robert put the phone on speaker and told her the boundaries were firm. He said she needed to accept responsibility for what she'd done before any relationship could be rebuilt. She started yelling again about how this was all my fault, how I'd poisoned him against her. Robert hung up. 5 seconds later, my phone started buzzing. Text after text from Linda. The first one said she was sorry, that she loved us and just wanted to help. The second one called me a manipulator who'd stolen her son. The third apologized again. The fourth accused me of planning this from the beginning. I showed Robert and he looked sick. I blocked Linda's number after she sent a text calling me a gold digger who married Robert for his future inheritance. The whole thing was ridiculous because we're an electrician and a medical supply purchasing agent, not exactly wealthy people. Our biggest luxury was taking Oliver to the zoo twice a year. Robert blocked her number too when she started texting him links to articles about parental alienation and how children need their grandparents in their lives. Our lawyer sent us an email that afternoon with copies of everything we'd given Linda at dinner and advised us to save all her communication attempts. He said we might need a restraining order if she kept escalating. I created a folder on my computer labeled Linda Evidence and started screenshots of every text, every call log, every voicemail. Robert sat next to me while I did it and kept rubbing his face with his hands. 2 weeks went by without hearing from Linda, and I started to relax. Maybe she'd finally accepted the situation. Then Oliver's school called on a Tuesday during my lunch break. The secretary said Oliver's grandmother had come to the office trying to pick him up, claiming there was a family emergency. My stomach dropped. I asked if they released him. She said no, they followed protocol and verified with the authorized pickup list, but Oliver was upset and confused in the office. I told her we were on our way and called Robert. We both left work and got to the school in 15 minutes. Oliver was sitting in the nurse's office with red eyes. He asked why Grandma said Daddy was in the hospital when he wasn't. I wanted to scream. The principal explained that Linda had seemed very convincing about the emergency, but they always verify. We thanked them for following procedure and immediately updated the authorized pickup list to explicitly exclude Linda. The principal asked if there was a family conflict they should know about for safety purposes. Robert explained there was an ongoing situation, and Linda wasn't allowed contact with Oliver. The principal made notes and said they'd alert all staff. That evening, I sat down with Oliver on his bed while Robert made dinner. I explained in words a 7-year-old could understand that Grandma was having some grown-up problems and made some choices that weren't safe. I said she couldn't visit for a while until she got help. Oliver played with his toy truck and asked if it was because of what she said about money being bad for kids. My blood went cold. I'd thought that conversation hadn't stuck with him. I told him money wasn't bad, and we'd always take care of him. He asked if Grandma was sick like his friend Jake's uncle who went away for medicine. I said something like that, which felt like lying, but I didn't know how else to explain it. Robert came in and sat on the other side of Oliver. He pulled our son close and promised we'd always keep him safe. Oliver hugged his dad, and I saw Robert's eyes were wet and red. He was trying not to cry in front of Oliver. Later that night, after Oliver fell asleep, Robert sat on our bed staring at nothing. I asked if he was okay. He said his mom used to read him stories every night when he was Oliver's age. Now she was traumatizing his son the same age he'd been. How did she turn into this person? Linda's sister Margaret called Robert the next day while he was at a job site. She said we were being cruel to an elderly woman who just wanted to be part of her grandson's life. Robert explained about the insurance fraud and forged documents. Margaret said it must have been a misunderstanding, that Linda would never do something like that on purpose. Robert told her about the police report. Margaret got quiet but then said family should forgive, that Linda was probably just confused. When Robert mentioned the false CPS report, Margaret went completely silent for a long moment. Then she said Linda must have been genuinely worried about something to go that far, still making excuses for criminal behavior. Robert told her he had to get back to work and hung up. He came home that night exhausted and didn't want to talk about it. Over the next month, Robert's phone kept ringing with relatives he hadn't talked to in years. His cousin from Michigan called saying we should give Linda another chance. His aunt from his dad's side called saying she'd heard we cut Linda off over nothing. Robert explained the situation to each person, but it was clear Linda had called them first with a very different story. Some believed Robert. Others seemed skeptical that sweet Linda could do those things. Robert's cousin posted vague stuff on Facebook about respecting your elders and how modern parents were too sensitive. I saw Robert reading the comments one night, relatives agreeing that young people today didn't understand family loyalty. I felt more and more alone. Robert's entire extended family seemed to be lining up against us based on Linda's lies. I started worrying about Thanksgiving, about Christmas, about every future family gathering where we'd be the bad guys who cut out poor grandma. Oliver would grow up with cousins who thought his parents were cruel. The weight of it pressed down on both of us. Oliver woke up screaming on a Thursday night. I ran to his room and found him crying, asking if we were going to heaven. I held him and said no. We were right here. He said he dreamed we went away and he was alone. Robert came in and we both stayed with him until he fell back asleep. Saturday night, he woke up crying again with the same question. I was so angry I could barely breathe. Linda's manipulation about our deaths had traumatized our 7-year-old into having real anxiety. I made an appointment with a child therapist for the following week, someone who specialized in family conflict. I started documenting everything in a notebook. Tuesday night nightmare about parents dying, Saturday night nightmare about being alone, questions about heaven. I wrote down everything Oliver said, every time he seemed worried, every mention of grandma or death or being left behind. If we needed evidence of the harm Linda caused, I was building it. The therapist met with Oliver alone for 30 minutes while Robert and I sat in the waiting room not talking. Then she called us in without Oliver. She said Linda's statements about money and death had created real anxiety that needed addressing through play therapy and reassurance techniques. She gave us strategies for helping Oliver feel secure. She suggested we might benefit from couples counseling too, because this kind of family conflict puts huge stress on marriages. I hadn't thought about that, but she was right. Robert and I barely talked anymore except about Linda or Oliver. We were exhausted. The therapist said she could provide a written statement about the psychological impact of Linda's behavior if we needed it for legal purposes. That felt validating, like a professional was confirming this was serious and not us overreacting. We scheduled weekly appointments for Oliver and she gave us a referral for couples therapy. I hired a private investigator the next week. It cost $400, but I needed to understand why Linda was this desperate about our insurance money. A retired teacher with a paid-off condo shouldn't be this obsessed with money that wasn't hers. The report came back 10 days later. Linda had over $30,000 in credit card debt, mostly from online shopping sites. Clothes, jewelry, home goods, all charged on multiple cards. She'd taken out a reverse mortgage on her condo last year and was burning through that money fast. Her teacher's pension covered her basic bills, but she'd been living way beyond her means for at least 2 years. The investigator found evidence she'd been researching life insurance payouts and trust fund management 6 months before she even started talking to us about changing beneficiaries. She'd been planning this. She saw Oliver's potential inheritance as her retirement plan, her way out of the debt hole she'd dug. It explained everything but didn't excuse anything. Robert read the report 3 times. Then he put his head in his hands and cried. I watched him sit there with his head in his hands, shoulders shaking, and something broke in me too. This wasn't just about Linda anymore. This was about Robert realizing his mother had been planning to steal from our son for months, maybe longer. I sat down next to him on the couch and put my arm around his shoulders. He leaned into me and just cried. Not angry crying or frustrated crying, but the kind of crying you do when you lose something you can't get back. After a while, he lifted his head and looked at me with red eyes. He said he kept thinking maybe she was just confused or scared about money, that there had to be some explanation that made sense. But the investigator's report showed she'd been researching life insurance payouts and trust fund loopholes 6 months before she even mentioned the beneficiary thing to us. She'd planned this whole thing. She saw our family as a way to fix her debt problem. I told him I was sorry, that I knew how much this hurt. He said the worst part was realizing she never cared about protecting Oliver. She just wanted access to the money. Every conversation, every article she brought over, every time she tried to turn us against each other, it was all calculated. I held him and we sat there for a long time not talking. That night in bed, I could feel the distance between us, even though we were lying right next to each other. Robert stared at the ceiling and I knew he was thinking about his mom. I wanted to say something helpful, but everything felt wrong. The next morning, I called the therapist who'd been working with Oliver and asked if she knew anyone who did couples counseling. She gave me 2 names and I made an appointment with the first one who had availability. Robert didn't argue when I told him. I think he knew we needed help getting through this. The couples therapist was a woman named Dr. Smith, who had an office in a medical building near the hospital. We went on a Thursday evening after work, sitting in her waiting room not talking, both of us on our phones avoiding each other. When she called us in, she had us sit on a couch facing her chair. She asked what brought us in, and I looked at Robert, waiting for him to start. He didn't say anything, so I explained the whole situation with Linda. The fraud attempt, the false CPS report, the financial investigation, everything. Dr. Smith took notes and nodded. Then she asked Robert how he was feeling about all of it. He was quiet for a minute, then said he felt like he was failing everyone. His mom, me, Oliver, himself, Dr. Smith asked what he meant by failing. Robert said he should have seen what his mom was doing sooner, Should have stopped it before it got this bad. Should have protected us better. I started to interrupt, but Dr. Smith held up her hand. She asked Robert if he thought he could have changed his mother's choices. He said probably not, but he should have tried harder. Doctor? Smith asked what trying harder would have looked like. Robert didn't have an answer. Over the next few sessions, Dr. Smith helped us talk about things we'd been avoiding. Robert admitted he'd been minimizing his mother's behavior because accepting the truth meant accepting he couldn't fix her. He said his whole life he'd been trying to be the good son, the one who made things easier for her after his dad died. The idea that she could look at him and Oliver and just see dollar signs made him feel like he'd failed at the one thing he thought he was good at. I told him that wasn't fair to himself, that Linda's choices weren't his responsibility. Doctor. Smith asked me how I was feeling, and I said honestly I was angry. Angry at Linda, obviously, but also frustrated that Robert kept wanting to give her chances even after everything she did. I said sometimes it felt like I was fighting this battle alone, because Robert was still trying to protect his mom's feelings instead of protecting our family. Robert looked hurt when I said that, and I felt bad. But Dr. Smith said it was important to be honest. She asked Robert if what I said felt true to him. He thought about it and said, yeah, probably. He said he kept hoping there was some way to fix things with his mom without completely cutting her off, but he knew that wasn't realistic anymore. Doctor. Smith asked him what he needed to let go of that hope. Robert said he needed to accept that the mom he wanted wasn't the mom he actually had. That session was hard, but we both left feeling like maybe we could get through this together. 3 months after that dinner where we'd shown Linda the updated will, a thick envelope arrived from a law firm we didn't recognize. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were legal papers showing Linda had filed for grandparents' visitation rights in our state. The petition claimed we were denying her a relationship with Oliver without cause, and that she had a legal right to see her grandson. I felt sick reading it. Robert came home from a job site and found me sitting at the kitchen table staring at the papers. He read them twice, then called our lawyer. Our lawyer said to come in the next morning to discuss it. That night, neither of us slept much. I kept thinking about all the documentation we had of Linda's behavior, but also knowing that grandparents' rights cases could be weird and unpredictable. Some judges really believed grandparents should have access to grandkids no matter what. At the lawyer's office, we spread out all the papers on his conference table. He read through Linda's petition carefully, then looked at us and said her case was weak given everything she'd done. But he also said we needed to take it seriously and prepare a strong defense. He asked if we had documentation of the fraud attempt. We did. The CPS investigation. We had the closure letter. The school incident where she tried to pick up Oliver. We had the incident report. The therapist's statement about Oliver's anxiety. We could get that. He said to gather everything and bring it to him within 2 weeks. He'd start preparing our response to the petition. Over the next month, we became experts at documentation. I made copies of the insurance company's fraud report, highlighting the parts where they confirmed someone had tried to forge Robert's signature. The CPS investigator had been so apologetic about the whole thing that she'd written a detailed closure letter explaining the complaint was clearly vindictive and without merit. I got 3 copies of that. The school principal gave us the incident report from when Linda showed up claiming a family emergency and tried to take Oliver. Robert's hands shook as he sat at our dining room table writing his own statement about his mother's behavior. He wrote about how she'd always been controlling, but this was different. How she'd gone from suggesting we reconsider our beneficiaries to committing fraud. How she'd traumatized Oliver by telling him his parents might die and she'd take care of him. How her actions showed she cared more about money than about Oliver's well-being. I read it when he finished and had to leave the room because seeing him write those words about his own mother made me want to cry. My sister wrote an affidavit supporting our decision to cut Linda off. She detailed the times she'd witnessed Linda's manipulation, including a family dinner where Linda had pulled her aside and tried to convince her that I was making bad financial decisions and she should talk to me about changing our estate planning. My brother wrote one too, confirming he'd witnessed Linda's obsession with the insurance money and her attempts to play Robert and me against each other. Seeing our family rally around us like this helped counter the isolation we felt from Robert's relatives who still believed Linda's version of events. Our lawyer compiled everything into a thick binder with tabs and an index. He said it was one of the most well-documented cases he'd seen. A week after we submitted everything to our lawyer, Robert got a call from his Uncle Tom, his dad's younger brother, who we only saw at holidays. Tom said he'd heard through the family that Linda was suing for grandparents' rights, and he wanted to talk to us privately. We invited him over that Saturday. Tom sat in our living room looking uncomfortable and said he wasn't surprised by Linda's behavior. Robert asked what he meant. Tom said Linda had pulled similar stuff with Robert's dad before he died. She'd tried to convince him to change his will to give her control of everything, claimed she was better at managing money than he was. Robert's dad had refused, and they'd had a huge fight about it a few months before his heart attack. Tom said he'd always wondered if that stress had contributed to his brother's death. Robert went pale hearing this. Tom said Linda had a pattern of trying to control family money going back years. After Robert's dad died, she'd tried to contest the will, even though it was straightforward, and left everything to Robert as the only child. The lawyer had shut that down fast, but it showed her mindset. Tom said he'd testify about all of this if it would help our case. He said his brother would have wanted Robert's family protected from Linda's manipulation. Robert thanked him, and after Tom left, we just sat there processing this new information. It wasn't just about us. Linda had been doing this for decades. 2 months after filing our response, we got notice that the court was ordering mediation before any hearing. We had to sit in a conference room with Linda, both our lawyers and a court-appointed mediator who was supposed to help us find common ground. The mediation was scheduled for a Wednesday morning at the courthouse. Robert and I showed up in our best clothes, both of us nervous. Linda was already there with her lawyer, a woman in her 50s who looked tired. The mediator was a man in his 60s with gray hair and glasses who explained the process. He said mediation was voluntary and confidential, that his job was to help us reach an agreement that worked for everyone, especially Oliver. Linda started crying almost immediately. She said she loved Oliver so much and just wanted to be his grandma. She talked about all the times she'd babysat him when he was little, the clothes she'd bought him, how much she missed him. The mediator nodded sympathetically and asked us why we'd cut off contact. Our lawyer laid out the insurance fraud attempt. Linda's lawyer jumped in saying it was a misunderstanding, that Linda had just been trying to help make sure Oliver was taken care of. The mediator asked Linda directly about forging Robert's signature on insurance documents. Linda said she never forged anything. She was just inquiring about options. Our lawyer pulled out the insurance company's report showing someone had used Robert's social security number and personal information to request beneficiary change forms. Linda's face got red and she said maybe she'd made a mistake, but her intentions were good. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I looked right at the mediator and said Linda hadn't just committed insurance fraud. She'd filed a false CPS report claiming we were neglecting Oliver financially. She'd shown up at his school and tried to take him without permission by lying about a family emergency. She'd traumatized our 7-year-old by telling him repeatedly that his parents might die, and she'd manage his inheritance. She'd tried to turn Robert and me against each other by lying to both of us about what the other one said. She'd spent months researching how to get control of life insurance money that wasn't hers. This wasn't a misunderstanding or good intentions. This was calculated manipulation by someone who saw her grandson as a paycheck. Linda's lawyer shifted in her seat, looking uncomfortable. The mediator's expression changed from sympathetic to concerned. He asked Linda if these allegations were true. Linda's face went from red to purple, and she started yelling that I was a liar who'd turned her son against her. She said I'd always been jealous of her relationship with Robert, and this was my way of cutting her out of the family. Robert said quietly that everything I'd said was true, and we had documentation of all of it. The mediator asked if Linda would be willing to attend therapy and accept supervised visits with Oliver as a starting point. Linda said absolutely not. She wasn't going to be treated like a criminal for trying to protect her family. She wanted full grandparent visitation rights with no supervision. Her lawyer tried to quiet her down, but Linda kept going. She said we were being cruel and unreasonable, and the court would see that. The mediator looked at his notes for a long time. Then he said it didn't seem like we were going to reach an agreement today. He'd file a report with the court saying mediation was unsuccessful, and a hearing would be scheduled. Linda grabbed her purse and stormed out. Her lawyer apologized to us quietly before following her client. 2 weeks later, we were sitting in family court waiting for our case to be called. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh. Linda sat on the opposite side with her lawyer. She didn't look at us. When the judge called our case, we all stood and moved to tables in front of the bench. The judge was a woman in her 50s who looked like she'd heard every family drama imaginable and wasn't impressed by any of it. She asked Linda's lawyer to present her case first. The lawyer talked about how grandparents have important relationships with grandchildren and how those relationships benefit kids. She said Linda had been an involved grandmother for years, and we'd suddenly cut her off without giving her a chance to address our concerns. She made it sound like we were being unreasonable and vindictive. Then it was our lawyer's turn. He walked the judge through everything: the insurance fraud attempt with documentation from the insurance company. The false CPS report with the closure letter explaining it was vindictive. The school incident report. The therapist's statement about Oliver's anxiety. Tom's testimony about Linda's history of trying to control family money. Our lawyer laid it all out methodically, piece by piece. I had to testify about the fraud attempt and how we'd discovered it. Linda glared at me from across the courtroom the whole time I was on the stand. I kept my voice steady and stuck to the facts. When our lawyer asked how Linda's behavior had affected Oliver, I explained about the nightmares and the anxiety and the questions about whether we were dying. Robert testified next about his mother's escalating behavior. I could see how hard it was for him to speak against her in court. His voice cracked a couple times, but he got through it. He talked about how she'd tried to manipulate him and me against each other, how she'd put her desire for financial control above Oliver's well-being, how her actions had damaged their relationship beyond repair. The judge asked Robert directly if he thought supervised visits would be appropriate. Robert said no, that Oliver was finally starting to feel secure again after months of therapy, and reintroducing Linda would undo all that progress. The judge reviewed all the documents our lawyer had submitted, taking her time with each one. She read Tom's testimony about Linda's pattern of financial manipulation. She looked at the therapist's report about Oliver's anxiety. Nobody spoke while she read. Finally, the judge looked up and said she was ready to rule. She said grandparents' rights exist to maintain beneficial relationships between grandparents and grandchildren when those relationships serve the child's best interests. However, the evidence showed that Linda had engaged in insurance fraud, filed false reports with Child Protective Services, attempted to remove the child from the school without authorization, and caused documented psychological harm to the child through her statements about death and inheritance. The judge said Linda's actions demonstrated she prioritized financial control over Oliver's well-being. Based on the evidence, Linda's petition for grandparents' visitation rights was denied with prejudice, meaning she couldn't refile. Robert squeezed my hand so hard under the table. I felt relief flood through me, so intense I thought I might cry. Linda stood up and started yelling at the judge that this wasn't fair, that we'd poisoned everyone against her. Her lawyer pulled her back down and whispered urgently to her. The judge said if there were any further outbursts, she'd clear the courtroom. Linda sat down, but I could see her shaking with rage. After the judge dismissed us, our lawyer said we should file for a protective order based on everything that had happened. He said Linda's behavior at the school and her escalation throughout this process suggested she might not respect the court's decision. We went back to his office that afternoon and he prepared the paperwork. 2 days later, we were back in front of the same judge. Our lawyer presented the evidence of Linda's attempts to contact us despite being told not to, the school incident, the harassment through other family members. The judge granted a 2-year protective order. Linda had to stay 500 feet away from our home, Oliver's school, and both our workplaces. She couldn't contact us directly or through third parties. If she violated the order, she'd face criminal charges. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt exhausted but safe for the first time in months. Robert put his arm around me, and we stood on the courthouse steps in the afternoon sun. We'd protected our family. We'd set boundaries and enforced them even when it was hard. Linda couldn't manipulate or threaten us anymore without facing real consequences. The legal system had finally backed us up. It wasn't the ending Robert had wanted with his mother, but it was the ending we needed to keep Oliver safe. The first few weeks after the courthouse were quiet. Too quiet. I kept waiting for Linda to show up somewhere, violate the order, give us another reason to call the police. But she didn't. Robert checked his phone constantly those first days, expecting angry texts or voicemails. Nothing came. Oliver asked twice when Grandma was coming back, and we told him she needed time to work on some grown-up problems. He accepted that easier than I expected. His therapist said kids are good at moving forward when the adults around them are stable and consistent. We were trying to be exactly that. 2 months after the court ruling, Oliver stopped waking up at night. Just stopped. One morning I realized he'd slept through the whole week without coming into our room asking if we were okay. Robert noticed it too. We sat at breakfast watching Oliver eat cereal and talk about his friend's new puppy, and Robert reached across the table and squeezed my hand. The relief on his face made my chest tight. Our couples therapist had been helping us work through everything. The way Robert felt guilty about his mother even though he knew cutting her off was right. The way I'd been carrying so much anger I couldn't let go of it. Slowly we were getting better at talking without one of us shutting down or getting defensive. We took Oliver to the zoo on a Saturday in April. Just the 3 of us walking around looking at animals, eating overpriced ice cream, being normal. Oliver held both our hands and swung between us, laughing. Robert smiled at me over Oliver's head, a real smile that reached his eyes. I hadn't seen that smile in over a year. It felt like we were finally breathing again. Tom started calling Robert every week. Robert's dad's brother had always been around but distant, the way extended family often is. After the court case, he made an effort, started inviting us over for dinner, asking if he could take Oliver to baseball games. The first time Tom picked Oliver up to go see the minor league team play, Oliver was nervous. He came home 3 hours later talking nonstop about hot dogs and home runs and how Uncle Tom taught him to keep score. Tom had a garage full of tools and old car parts, and he started teaching Oliver basic stuff about how engines worked. Oliver would come back with grease on his hands and stories about carburetors and spark plugs that I didn't fully understand but loved hearing. Robert watched his son with his uncle, and I could see him processing something, maybe realizing that Linda's absence didn't mean Oliver had no grandparents, that family could be built in different ways than he'd expected. Margaret called on a Tuesday evening in late spring. Robert saw her name on his phone and almost didn't answer. I nodded at him to take it. He went into the bedroom and I heard his voice through the door, quiet and careful. When he came out 20 minutes later, his eyes were red. Margaret had talked to Tom. Tom told her everything, the real version, not Linda's story about being victimized by her ungrateful son and manipulative daughter-in-law. Margaret apologized, said she should have asked us directly instead of believing Linda without question. Robert told her he appreciated the call but wasn't ready to just go back to normal. She said she understood and would give him space. After he hung up, he sat on the couch and I sat next to him. He leaned his head on my shoulder and we stayed like that for a while. A few other relatives reached out over the next months. Robert's cousin, who'd posted vague Facebook stuff about respecting elders, sent a short message saying Tom had set him straight. Robert's aunt from his dad's side called to say she'd always known Linda had control issues and was sorry she hadn't said something sooner. Some of Robert's family stayed quiet, though. His mom's sister Margaret had other siblings who apparently still believed Linda's version, and Robert accepted that some relationships were just done. He couldn't force people to see the truth if they didn't want to. 6 months after the judge denied Linda's petition, we settled into a routine that felt stable. Oliver was doing great in 3rd grade, bringing home math tests with gold stars and stories about his friends. Robert had processed a lot of his grief about his mother in therapy, accepted that he'd done everything he could, and her choices were her own. Our marriage felt stronger than it had in years. We'd been through something that could have destroyed us and came out closer instead. We went back to our lawyer's office one afternoon to update everything one more time. Made sure all the emergency contacts at Oliver's school listed my sister and Tom. No mention of Linda anywhere. Reviewed the educational trust paperwork with my brother, who was still the trustee. Confirmed my sister was still guardian in the will. Our lawyer made copies of the protective order and gave us extras to keep in our cars and at work, just in case. I felt confident walking out of that office that Oliver's future was locked down tight. Linda couldn't touch it even if she tried. The protective order still had a 1.5 years left on it and Linda hadn't violated it once. Maybe she'd finally understood that her actions had permanent consequences. Maybe she'd moved on. I didn't know and didn't care. My job was protecting my family and I'd done that. A year after that dinner where we'd handed Linda the updated will, I stood at our kitchen window watching Oliver play in the backyard. Robert was out there with him, teaching him how to throw a baseball properly. Tom had come over for dinner and was sitting in a lawn chair giving advice and laughing at Oliver's wild throws. The sun was setting and everything looked golden and peaceful. Oliver ran over to Robert and hugged him, then ran to Tom and did the same. No fear about death, no anxiety about money, just a kid being loved by his family. Robert caught my eye through the window and waved. I waved back. We'd learned to talk to each other better, to prioritize our immediate family over extended family pressure and guilt. We'd learned that setting boundaries wasn't cruel, it was necessary. Oliver's college fund kept growing with our regular deposits every month. The educational trust sat secure with my brother managing it. My sister was still guardian in our will, ready to step in if anything ever happened to us. Life wasn't perfect. We still had stress from work and bills and normal family stuff. But we were safe. We were stable. We were free from Linda's obsession with controlling money that was never hers. That freedom was worth everything we'd fought for.